Chapter 4, the Dagesh. The Dagesh, like the schwa, or the simple schwa, comes in two varieties. You have the Dagesh lene. The word lene is a Latin term that means, of course, soft. So the soft Dagesh. And then you have the Dagesh forte, or the strong Dagesh. And so we want to look at both of these Dagesh. So the first thing we're going to look at is the Dagesh lene, or the soft Dagesh. And you can remember from chapter 1 that we had 6 letters that could take a dot. Well, that dot we will now call a Dagesh. And there were 6 letters that could take a Dagesh lene. That's what you saw with those 6 letters. If you remember, only 3 made a difference in pronunciation, and that was the bait, and the kaf, and the pei. The other 3, really, there is no difference in pronunciation. So you want to keep that in mind. With a dot in a letter, you, of course, with the 3 that we're making a distinction on pronunciation, you have what's called a plosive pronunciation. In other words, it's a hard sound, like the B in boy, the P is in pie, and so forth. Where without it, it has the sporantic, and by sporantic we mean pushing air through your lips, and that's what you get with a V and with an F, and so forth. And so again, that's Dagesh lene can only occur in those 6 letters. And what we've done is we've made, Hebrew grammarians historically, not me personally, have made a word up in order for you to remember those 6 letters. And that word is bigad, and then kafat, like this. And we're not going to point these exactly right, but you get the idea. Bigad kafat. And so I'm going to refer to something called bigad kafat letters, and that's these 6 letters that will admit a Dagesh lene. It's only these 6 letters that can have a Dagesh lene in them, and so you need to remember this term because we will use it quite frequently. Bigad kafat letters. Okay, well, when does the bigad kafat letter receive a Dagesh lene? Well, that's what we do here in number 3, and it's usually at the beginning of a syllable. At the beginning of a syllable, normally you will get, if that syllable begins with a bigad kafat letter, that bigad kafat letter will receive a Dagesh lene. And so in the examples I give you, you have a word like bain, like this, and notice it's a word that, or a syllable that begins with a bigad kafat letter. And usually when they begin a syllable or begin a word, normally you get the Dagesh lene. And there's a footnote down below that will give you the exception to it when I talk about conjunctive accents. Words in Hebrew can have either a conjunctive or a disjunctive accent. Words that are conjoined together with a conjunctive accent. If that word were to end, suppose you had a word that ended with a vowel, and then you had a word next to it that begins with the bigad kafat letter, and yet there's a conjunctive accent telling you to read these together, then you would not get the Dagesh lene here. But if you had a disjunctive accent here, so here's a word that's ending with a vowel but has a disjunctive accent, it means you've got to stop in your pronunciation here, then you would get a Dagesh lene for the following bigad kafat letter. But that's the footnote 4 there. So just keep that in mind. But again, the main thing is, if you see a word beginning with a bigad kafat letter, for right now, just put a Dagesh lene in there. And if it's in the middle of a word, again, what it's got to do is it's got to begin a syllable. Namely, it's got to be after a silent schwa. And so you can see in a word like this, yikbor. Here, if we were to divide the syllables, we have to divide here because this schwa is silent. It's preceded by a short vowel. And so the syllable is going to begin with a bigad kafat letter, and therefore the bigad kafat letter receives the Dagesh lene. It gets the hard pronunciation yikbor, not yikvor. Not with a V, but with a B as a boy. Yikbor is what you get there. All right, and at the end of a word, you can sometimes have 2 schwas at the end of a word. And if you have two schwas at the end of the word, of course, they're always silent. If you have two schwas at the end of a word, consecutive schwas at the end of a word, they're always silent. And but you can still have a Dagesh lene if it's preceded by the silent schwa, as you see here. It's not really beginning a syllable here. It is ending. But this would be shamart. You see, it would be a hard pronunciation here. And so there you can see shamart. Okay, so that's that. Now, when will Begad Kafad letters not receive the Dagesh lene? Well, if there's a vowel to the left of it, you will not. And so you have an example like this word here written. Here you have the bait here, of course, is a Begad Kafat letter. But notice it's preceded by a vowel sign. Sign and a vowel sound. And that sound of that vowel would get rid of any type of Dagesh lene. Dagesh lene has to begin the sound. But here you have a vowel in front of it, and that will wipe out the Dagesh lene. It's the same thing is true if you have a vocal schwa. If you have a vocal schwa beginning a word, you have the same situation. Namely, this schwa here beginning a word is vocal, and even that indistinct vocalic slur is enough to get rid of the Dagesh lene out of the kaf here. Vachol, vachol is how you want to pronounce that. Vachol is how you want to pronounce this. But right now, of course, I've told you to know these all as kametzes, but don't worry, soon we'll be making a distinction. Okay, so again, if you have a vocal schwa, there can be no Dagesh lene. All right. Next is section 3, the Dagesh forte. The Dagesh forte is the doubling of a letter, and that's different from the lene. The lene is simply distinguished in pronunciation for 3 letters in modern Hebrew. When we come to the Dagesh forte, we're actually doubling letters now. And so, as we saw last time, we have a form like this right here, kitel. And when we look at that, we have this Dagesh, and this is a Dagesh forte. And as we talked about last time, that really represents a doubling of letters. Excuse me. And that would look like this. Kit and then tel. You can see we have 2 letters. But Hebrew will frequently, instead of writing letters consecutively, they'll give you a dot in the letter, which would represent this right here, the tet and the silent schwa. And so that will go as a Dagesh forte. And today in modern Hebrew, you really don't hear the doubling so much. They just say kitel. But those who speak Arabic and so forth, you would hear the 2 T's in Arabic. Kitel, you'd hear both of them. And so the doubling is very important. And so that's what a Dagesh forte is. It is a doubling. It's a strengthening of the consonant. Now, the Dagesh forte can occur in any letter, including Begad Kafat letters. The only letters that will not accept a Dagesh forte are the guttural letters. The guttural letters, and this includes resh. So your aleph, your hey, your chet, your ayin, your resh. They will not accept Dagesh forte. But every other letter, including Begad Kafat letters, will indeed accept a Dagesh forte. Now, a Dagesh forte must be preceded by a vowel. And normally, again, 95% of the time, it's going to be a short vowel. So, again, the example I just gave you of kitel, notice you have a Dagesh forte here, and it's preceded by a short vowel. Now, if the syllable were accented here, then you could have a long vowel, but otherwise, you're always going to have a short vowel preceding it. But for a Dagesh forte, it always is preceded by a vowel, and again, usually short. One other rule is that Dagesh forte may not begin a word nor end a word. If you have it at the beginning of a word, you really have stuttering in Hebrew. And so you don't have a Dagesh forte at the beginning of the word. And you don't have it at the end of the word either. And so the example that I give you is the word am here. Really, there should be a Dagesh here. This goes back to a double mem. And so the word really is ayin mem mem. But again, Hebrew does not, they try to avoid writing consecutive consonants in the sense of the same consonant consecutively. And so what they will do is they will simply just put one consonant there. But if you were to put something on the end of this word, if you were to add, like, let's say, a pronominal suffix on the end of it, well, when you add something to the end of it, it's no longer at the end. And so now you'll get a Dagesh forte, and that Dagesh forte shows you the doubling of the mem here. But, again, you will not get Dagesh forte at the end of a word. They will not do this. Hebrew won't allow you to do that. And so what we like to do, at least for this grammar, is we'd like to talk about that Dagesh as hovering. It's simply hovering. It's not there, and you will never see a hovering Dagesh in the Hebrew Bible, but you'll see it in my textbook. And so that Dagesh is hovering. And then when you put something on the end of a word like this, that hovering Dagesh can actually land and you see the doubling. So you want to keep that in mind. Okay. Well, now we want to distinguish between Dagesh forte and Dagesh lene. We want to make a distinction between the two. Sometimes you're going to see a dot in the middle of a letter and you're not going to know. Is that simply a pronunciation dot like a lene, or is it a doubling dot? And it's very important in Hebrew to be able to distinguish between those two. So we want to distinguish between them, and look at number one. A Dagesh in a non-bigad kafat letter has to be a forte. So if you see something like, let's say a tet like I've been showing you with a Dagesh in it, it must be a forte. The only real problem is when you have a Dagesh in a bigad kafat letter, because that can either be a lene or a forte. But if you do not have a bigad kafat letter, like the tet that I have here, it has to be a forte. Okay, so that's real easy. So it's just 6 letters that we really have to do the real tough distinguishing between the two. And so let's look at that now. So again, Dagesh lene occurs at the beginning of words, or to the left of a silent schwa. So if you have a dot in a word, a letter that begins a word, immediately you know that's got to be a lene. And if you see again, if it's a bigad kafat letter and you see a dot in it after a silent schwa, again, you know that's got to be a lene. For the Dagesh forte, it must be preceded by a vowel. And again, I'll remind you that's normally a short vowel. And so really that's the way you determine it. So let's take a word like this. Shiber. Okay, what do we do with this word? We see we have a Dagesh here, and it's a bigad kafat letter. So that means that Dagesh there can be a lene or a forte. And what has to determine is what precedes it. If a silent schwa precedes it, then that's a Dagesh lene. If a vowel precedes it, it's a Dagesh forte. A vowel precedes it, therefore we're looking at a Dagesh forte. That's a doubling dot. And to be very technical in pronunciation, shiber, 2 B's there. Very important, 2 B's. So, again, it's very important that when you see a bigad kafat letter with a Dagesh, you have to see what's before it. If what's before it's a silent schwa, you've got a lene. If it's a vowel, you've got a forte. And don't worry about a vocal schwa. That's not going to be a problem because there cannot be a lene there. It cannot be a forte. Vocal schwa is not going to precede either one, so don't worry about that. Okay, I mentioned that certain letters will not admit a Dagesh forte, namely the gutturals, and that includes the resh. But also, there are certain letters that if they have a vocal schwa under them, they can also omit the Dagesh forte, not lene, but forte. And look at footnote 5 there, and you'll see the letters that do that. And again, there's been a mnemonic device, an artificial word made up so that you remember this. They're called Skinnem-Levy letters, and I write those out. And those letters, if they have a vocal schwa under them, can at times, not always, but many times, they will omit the Dagesh forte. And so you just have to keep that in mind. So the forte can sometimes vanish when they have what's called a Skinnem-Levy letter, which is any kind of S letter, the liquid and nasal letters Lamed, Mem, or Nun, and then of course the letters Kof, Vav, and Yod. If they have a vocal schwa under them, sometimes the Dagesh forte will disappear. So you want to keep that in mind also. Now we want to talk about the Dagesh in relationship to the syllable. Remember, the Dagesh forte always indicates a closed syllable. So again, let me just blow it up so that you can see it. Get the Hebrew electron microscope out, and this is the Dagesh. But we've blown it up to such an extent that you can actually see what the Dagesh is. It's a tet, and it's got a schwa under it, and obviously it belongs right here. And so, just like we would divide consecutive schwas, and we put a line in between the two, what we're going to have to do this time is wrap the Dagesh. We will wrap the Dagesh forte. And when we do that, this syllable here, this first syllable, will always be closed. Okay? So this time we will just go to normal view. We have a situation like this. This is a Dagesh forte. We will wrap the forte, and this syllable will be considered closed because, again, there's another tet there and there's a silent schwa there. That's a closed syllable. And then this syllable here will be considered open, and the reason for that is that it ends in this vowel. This vocal schwa here begins the syllable. So again, it's very important to recognize that the Dagesh forte always indicates a closed syllable. And you can see how I'm wrapping that syllable. Okay, finally, in section 6 of this chapter, we want to talk about what's called the mapik. You've learned a Dagesh lene, you've learned a Dagesh forte, and I told you you can't have that in a guttural, but there's one guttural, the hey, that can receive a dot, but you don't want to see that as a lene, a Dagesh forte. This is something called a mapik. A mapik simply makes this hey able to close a syllable. So remember, usually we have words that end in this hey, and what we've said is when you divide the syllable, that this syllable here has to be open. If a syllable ends with a final hey, or if it ends with a final aleph, it's an open syllable. However, if you were to have a mapik in the final hey, that now closes the syllable, and this is considered closed. But again, this is not doubling, not changing the pronunciation really. What it's doing is it's making this hey where it really closes. Now I have a footnote on 7, and it talks about that this makes this what we call a real hey, as opposed to what you often see with the hey at the end of the word, like again this example here. This hey here is actually a phony hey that is written there. It's not it's not a real hey that you would pronounce in any way. It's simply that if you had an unpointed text in Hebrew, suppose you didn't have the vowel points, this would tell you to read a long kametz here, and so this just simply aids in reading. That's all it does. It's not a real H. It's simply an aid to reading this vowel here. However, when you have mapik, a mapik is not simply an aid to reading. It is the real McCoy. It's a real H. It must be pronounced. So there is somewhat of a difference in pronunciation, but most of the time in modern Hebrew you wouldn't tell a difference. So really, for modern Hebrew purposes, in pronunciation you wouldn't tell a difference. But again, when you see the mapik, it closes. So really, let me just go back to this. I'm making up a word here. You have the division. This would now be a closed syllable. Why? Because there's a mapik in this final hey. That's why. So again, it's very important that you keep that in mind. Okay, that's chapter 4. Now it's up to you to do the exercises.